The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for coming here, and I also appreciate your book and the work, and frankly, just yet again want to highlight the really heroic work that the Federal Reserve did to create stable markets, particularly in March and April of 2020. Since then, of course, there have been a lot of economic distortions, one of which is the ongoing inability of the Federal Reserve to stabilize its own balance sheet, which is now over $9 trillion. I appreciate Mr. Perlmutter highlighting some of the good news. Frankly, I'm positive that he has previously operated a lemonade stand, because he can always turn something good out of the lemons. So there's no good news, but the concern is that in the long term, this has come at the expense of sound money. And so just over a year ago, I talked to you about sound money, and as the U.S. dollar represents sound money, because many of us anticipated that inflation was not transitory, and that the quantity theory of money might have some impact on inflation. So in light of the fact that we have seen substantial change in the rate of inflation now versus what was showing up then but was anticipated, do you still think that the U.S. dollar is sound money? And either way, what are the threats to the U.S. dollar as sound money?
The U.S. dollar is sound money, yes. The threats to the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency really, in the near term, are to displace the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency, if that's your question. You need to be a very attractive place to hold large amounts of reserves.
It's really different than that, because we are probably still going to be the reserve currency, since the world grades on a curve, and frankly, the planet's never had this much debt since World War II. So all of the countries around the world did similar things. The discipline of the Bretton Woods era was gold. I don't know that there's magic just in gold, but there is magic in discipline. So if you look at sound money being defined by a stable store of value, an efficient means of exchange, and a trusted record of an account, you've at least taken some dings on store of value. And so as you've seen people decide to filter transactions and develop technology and regulatory frameworks that are intended to be able to filter transactions, it's not as trusted or efficient as a means of exchange or a record of account. And so those kinds of things, not so much do we do okay on the curve, but is it truly sound?
Yeah, I'm not sure I followed the last part, but I do think that, look, inflation is indisputably too high. We are using our tools to bring inflation back down to levels of price stability, and we will accomplish that task. Longer term, the U.S. dollar is easily the best currency, and it's because of what I just said. It's also because of the rule of law, and the fact that we're the incumbent, and we as long as we observe the rule of law and keep the dollar relatively, keep inflation low and predictable, that will remain the reserve currency.
Yeah, okay, so thank you, Chairman. And look, historically, there have been multiple reserve currencies, and generally, when something loses its status as reserve currency, it's not just because of other things that unfold, but it's because the value is debased. And we can come up with fancy words like modern monetary theory or quantitative easing or, similar to quantitative easing, but not really the same. When the Federal Reserve's balance sheet's growing, in a way it represents the Fed as the lender of last resort. We're not constrained by the taxes we collect. We're not even constrained by the amount of money the world will lend us. We're constrained only by the will of Congress to not spend more. And what are you going to do? Not cover the spending, the prolific spending by Congress? So moving on, just talking about the Fed's role. Of course, stable prices is really one component. The other is full employment. And I wonder if you think, in light of Mr. Perlmutter's reference to Chart 2, if Chart 4, which is the labor force participation rate, trends the right way. And as you link to the next thing as a regulator, there's a lot of pressure for you to do ESG. What can the Fed do, and what does Congress need to do to strike those balances?
With relative to ESG,
And full employment.
well, full employment, I think most members of the FOMC now think we are at labor market conditions that are consistent with maximum employment.
With 60% labor force participation, 62?
I mean, the maximum employment can never be higher than the level that's consistent with price stability.
The gentleman's time has
I think we're
expired.
at that level.